Sweden stayed officially neutral through the Second World War, but couldn't fully count on a single foreign supplier either. So it ended up building nearly all of its own military hardware from scratch, fighter planes included. Staying neutral meant arming yourself. When the United States placed an arms embargo on Sweden in 1940, fighters Sweden had already paid for simply stopped arriving. Sweden's answer was to build an entirely new aircraft factory within a few years and design its own fighter, the J-22, from the ground up. Nearly 200 were built, small and light, but with firepower that genuinely held its own against experienced enemy pilots. Saab B-17. The Saab B-17, doubling as a light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, was one of the young Saab company's first fully independent designs, built because foreign equivalents were either unavailable or politically too risky to acquire. Saab B-18. The twin-engine Saab B-18 came out of the same necessity to build a modern air force without dependable foreign supply lines, a program that took years partly because Sweden had to develop engines, tooling, and expertise from scratch that other nations already had. B-3. Licensed German Junkers Ju-86, neutral Sweden's medium bomber capability came, of all places, from a German design. The B-3 was a Swedish license-built German Junkers Ju-86, proof that neutrality in practice meant taking technical advantage of both sides of the war wherever it was actually possible. Gloucester Gladiator, or J-8. The imported British Gladiator biplane still formed the backbone of Swedish fighter squadrons at the war's start, already outdated when delivered, but the only option available before homegrown designs like the J-22 were even ready to fly. The tanks had to be self-made too, for exactly the same reasons. STRV M42, at over 20 tons and carrying a real 75mm gun, was Sweden's most modern wartime tank, built specifically because importing from Germany or the Allies had both become politically impossible at the same time. STRV M40, the lighter tank, technically an evolution of imported Czechoslovak design principles, filled the gap before the heavier M42 was available in real numbers. STRV M31, developed in the early 1930s, was the STRV M31 was already technically obsolete by the war's start, but it stayed in service anyway because Sweden couldn't afford to quickly retire vehicles that still functioned. STRV M21, Sweden's very first domestically built tank, dating to just after the First World War, was still serving in training units 2 decades later, a vehicle that literally spanned both world wars without ever being fully replaced. One weapon from this era outlived every political tension that had created it: the Husqvarna M3739, a Swedish license-built version of the Finnish Suomi submachine gun, armed Swedish soldiers throughout the entire war. A foreign design Sweden adopted because Finland, as a Norded neighbor, was politically far less loaded a source than any major power. Kulspruta Pistol M45. Developed at the war's end to replace the licensed Suomi with a cheaper design of its own, the M45 later became world-famous as the Swedish K, even seeing use by American special forces in Vietnam, until Sweden imposed its own export ban in 1966 in political protest against that war, forcing American manufacturers to simply copy the design to keep using it. Kulspruta M42. The heavily modified rebuild of the American Browning system served as the heavy machine gun of Swedish infantry units, another case of Swedish engineers taking a foreign core concept and reworking it for domestic production instead of designing something entirely new. Gewehr M96. Despite its age, the Mauser-based Gewehr M96 bolt-action rifle still armed large parts of Swedish infantry, a design Sweden licensed decades before the war even began and kept manufacturing continuously ever since. Automatgewehr M42. Issued in smaller numbers to select units, the automatic Automatgewehr M42 was meant as a first step away from pure bolt-action rifles. A full army-wide shift to self-loading weapons for Sweden didn't actually arrive until well after the war ended. Even a ship's paint job became a political statement. Leonid-class submarines. The Leonid-class submarines was Sweden's first fully independent submarine design, developed as a direct response to growing German power in the Baltic as early as the late 1930s, fitted with purpose-built weapon systems that required no foreign license at all. The white neutrality stripes. Starting in June 1940, every Swedish warship carried two conspicuous white stripes painted across the deck and hull, not a weapon system, but a visible signal to both warring sides meant to prevent an accidental attack on a neutral ship. Göteborg-class destroyers. Destroyers like the HSWMS Sundsvall and HSWMS Malmö patrolled Swedish waters throughout the war, not just declaring neutrality, but visibly enforcing it in case either side of the conflict ever tried to ignore it. T-class fast attack boats. Small, fast torpedo boats like the T-30 supplemented the larger warships in coastal patrol, agile enough to respond quickly to border violations without tying up the capacity of larger shipyards. Coastal submarine U-3. Smaller coastal submarines like U-3 monitored tight waterways and shipping lanes where the larger Leonid boats would simply have been too big and too valuable to risk. In the end, Sweden's biggest weapon wasn't any single piece of technology, it was owning that technology independently. Pansarvärnskanon M42. Built on the realization that imported guns couldn't be guaranteed resupply in a real crisis, the M42 anti-tank gun gave Swedish infantry a weapon whose entire production chain stayed inside the country's own borders. Luftvärnskanon M36, a license-built version of a Swedish Bofors base design. The M36 anti-aircraft gun was adopted as a standard weapon by several other nations at the same time, Poland among them, and later the Allies too, quietly making neutral Sweden an arms exporter even while staying out of the fighting itself. Pansarbandwagen M42. The M42 armored personnel carrier grew directly out of watching German and Soviet tank tactics play out in the fighting next door, a Swedish answer to ideas it never had to test in combat of its own. Pansarbil M40. The M40 armored car, a light-wheeled reconnaissance vehicle, filled the gap where road mobility mattered more than off-road capability, alongside the heavier tracked fleet. Feldkannon M40. The domestically developed M40 field gun gradually replaced older artillery pieces dating from before the First World War that had, until then, still made up a significant part of Sweden's inventory. M42 Rifle Grenade Detachment gave individual infantrymen a limited anti-tank capability of their own, without every unit having to wait on a dedicated heavier gun to arrive. The Home Guards equipment. Civilian volunteer units, officially organized to supplement the regular army, were often issued older equipment retired decades earlier, a sign of exactly how far Sweden was prepared to go to arm every available man if the worst actually happened. The M45 stayed in active service all the way into 2007. Some answers to one war outlast several more that come after it.